Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It's lovely to be in the pulpit again. I am a little bit ill this morning, so if you hear croakiness or if I go on weird tangents because I'm just hopped up on cold and flu relief, just bear with me as I go along, okay? Now look, if you're new and visiting this morning, first of all, it's great to have you with us. You're very, very welcome. You also might be wondering how preaching works here at Watchman Church. Well, we have two services, one in the morning, one in the evening. In our evening services, we're working through 1 Samuel, which is great fun. And in our morning services, well, there's a bit more variety as we go through these things. The preachers, that is to say elders plus several others, we might do a one-off or we might work through our own mini-series. So, for example, in September, I finished my own mini-series, which I called The Pilgrim's Guide to Sunday Mornings. And I'd been preaching that for just over a year or so. As I said before, I think here, you have to have long memories in this church for the preaching series. I think you need to remember quite a few things month on month. The Pilgrim's Guide to Sunday Mornings was all about explaining why we do what we do on Sunday mornings. I'd recommend you go look it up. Not to blow my own trumpet, so to speak, but I'd recommend you go look it up. God willing, it's hopefully helpful for us. Well, a few months ago, we were having dinner with Johnny and Yuck and a few others. And Joe and I were sat opposite Chris and Emily. I remember, Emily, you said it, you probably don't even remember this, do you? Emily asked, what are you going to do? Sorry, it's the second time in a row, isn't it? What are you going to do after the Pilgrim's Guide series? And look, for a long time, I was convinced I was going to do a study of the Lord's Prayer. And in fact, in time, I hope and trust we will do that. I would love to still do that. But I've long wanted to do something else. I've wanted to tackle one Bible book in particular. It's an important book. We've heard it already this evening. It's a book not normally preached on. And yet, in my experience, it's a book that most Christians have a genuine desire to want to understand better. Of course, Watchman Church, that book is the book of Job. The book of Job. Why the book of Job? Well, in truth, I could give several different reasons for this. I could say, and I'd be right in saying, that we should study the book of Job because it's one of the most exquisite works in all of human civilization. So let me give you some quotes here. These are like back of the book recommendations for the book of Job. The greatest Jewish work of art, said Stephen Mitchell, an American poet. Thomas Carlyle, 19th century essayist, one of the greatest things ever written. James Anthony Fruder told it far above the poetry of this world. Victor Hugo of Les Mis fame called it perhaps the greatest masterpiece of the human mind. Whereas Lord Tennyson described it as the greatest poem of ancient and modern times. Daniel Webster, who was a post-revolutionary American politician, went even further, calling it the most wonderful poem of any age and language. These are high recommendations, aren't they? So I could say that. I'm preaching through this, we're looking at this because it's important, it's a good book. I could also say that it's been precious to me personally for many years, and it has. When I first started as an undergrad, I was interested in philosophy and the problem of evil, and it seemed like the book of Job spoke to that. When I first started studying biblical interpretation, I remember poring over commentaries on the book of Job. When I came to a greater appreciation of Baroque music, Chris Handel, of course, I know that my Redeemer liveth, is taken directly from Job 19:25. And when I came to a greater appreciation of art, William Blake's 22 illustrations of the book of Job, published in 1826, they're exquisite. You'll recognize them. If you search on Google, not now, don't do it now, later on. But if you search for them, you'll recognize them. They're exquisite. All of these reasons, brothers and sisters, are perfectly true, are perfectly legitimate reasons to want to study this book, and yet they still don't capture the whole. There is something else here in this book that I want us to focus on, and I want you to bear with me a little foolishness here, as in the words of Paul, to borrow his phrase. There is a reason why the book of Job resonates with me personally. It's not, and I repeat, not because I have a monopoly over stories of pain and suffering. I don't. And yet, various events over the past 20 years of my life and Joe's life have forced me to deal with my own flesh, my own weakness, my own sin, and yes, also with pain and tribulation. Well, I do not mean to turn this pulpit into my own private confessional. That's gauche, it's inappropriate, it's self-indulgent. But I just want to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Most of you will know that I suffer from a terribly bad back. That goes back to 2014 when I slipped 3 discs in my lower back. And after 6 months, the pain became, frankly, brothers and sisters, unbearable. Pacing and rubbing and pressing and twitching, that became my life. And shortly after, I was prescribed a handful of different drugs. I'll be honest with you, I've not hidden it from anyone. I became addicted to those drugs, to prescription medication, to prescription morphine and other things. Combined then with a rather unpleasant church experience in 2014, I retreated into myself. And life became something of a cell of my own making. I say this with no flippancy. I would pray that God would kill me. And I meant it. I meant it. In all of this, Jo was wonderful. She was a woman with valiant, courageous spirit, a beautiful spirit. She would even wash and clothe me. And yet life had changed by this point for us. Life used to be going out to barbecues or going out to the beach. And now I would literally just hide. I would hide in the house if people came around. I didn't want to see anyone. I didn't want to do anything. The pain was too much, or so I felt. And around this time, I met with a former New Testament tutor for coffee. And before we parted ways, he said he'd pray for me. And then he said this thing, which I remembered ever since. It's a nasty thing, pain. It ages you, doesn't it? And that's exactly what pain does. Many of you here in this room will know that. That's exactly what pain does. Whether it's physical or psychological or both, it ages you, it robs you of life, it drains you of energy and steals from you. And eventually the Lord, don't get me wrong, He just done some amazing things. He healed me inside and out. He sent me good doctors and surgeons. But I mean, even as recently as 2020, and I don't mean to say this flippantly, and I'm certainly not trying to suggest that we have some sort of monopoly on these sorts of stories. I'm just trying to lay this out and be honest with you as to why this book has resonated with me. In 2020, Jo and I received some bad news that fundamentally changed our lives. It was the news that we were unable to have children. And so we watched as our friends and those around us moved on in their seasons, moved on in their lives, and it felt like we were frozen in time. Now, men and women experience that differently. Women on a very existential level. Me, that is a pain that lingers and goes on and on and on. But regardless, we're talking about here about a pain that sits. Again, why am I telling you this? Please hear my heart, brothers and sisters. I'm not trying to make an exhibition of myself. I'm not trying to suggest that I'm an expert in tribulation. I'm not trying to sound like I own suffering or pain. Your stories will differ from mine, and yet you will still have similar stories. All of us are guaranteed one thing. This life brings hardship. In the words of Job himself, this is Job 14. Man who is born of a woman is few of days and full of trouble. He comes out like a flower and withers. He flees like a shadow and continues not. Watch on, church, this is why the book of Job is worth our attention. Because whether it's my story or your story, my tribulation or yours, this book is so beautiful, so enduring, so godly, precisely because it is so real. It captures the reality of what it's like for believers to endure hardships, to suffer, to hurt, to grieve. And yet, as the story of Job continues, we find God intervening in the midst of those tears and trials and tribulations. And through this book, He speaks still into all of our individual circumstances, no matter how bitter, whether past, present, or future. Again, in my experience, most of us, do we not know this already? Most Christians, I think, know that this book is special. We know that this book is important. And yet, in my experience, when I've talked with believers, we find it hard to crack. After all, it's 42 chapters long. That's not insignificant. And after God and Satan discussed Job, as we've heard this morning, there are 36 chapters of speeches. like 3 rounds of speeches between Job and his friends, after which God intervenes and puts everything right. And so, of course, it's going to be challenging for us to get a hold of it. And so with this in mind, I want to submit to you this new series. I don't intend to do an expository series on the book of Job, all 42 chapters, crossing every T, dotting every I. That's not what this is going to be. It'll be about 4 sermons. 4 sermons. The essence of this is that I want us to get our bearings, to get the sense of this book, to understand it in its substance. So these 4 parts. The first sermon, we're going to look at Job 1 to 3. Nick has very kindly, I kind of unfairly gave him 3 chapters to read. He did a very good job, by the way, Nick. But we're going to look at Job 1 to 3. Next time, in early December, we're going to look at Job 4 all the way to 27. And I know that sounds like a lot, but trust me, it'll make sense. And then the next time, 28 to 31. And then the next one after that, 32 to 42, when God intervenes. But here's the question now. Where shall we begin this study? I want us to get our bearings. You know, when you go map orientating and you have to sort of flip the map around, that's what we're going to do with this book to begin with. I want us to think about the book of Job itself, its place in the Bible, its place in history, its cast of characters. But before we do that, let us just pray. Lord, as I said in the vestry this morning, I need you. My voice is failing. My health is failing. But Lord, you are so good. You're so reliable. We can depend upon you. The one who keeps Israel neither slumbers nor sleeps. Lord, abide with us, you who change us not. Help me, Lord, to be able to preach this. Lord, I ask that this would be a blessing to your people. And it wouldn't just be me saying things, but Lord, it would speak to souls in a way that edifies and sanctifies, makes us more, conforms us more into the image of Christ. Help me, Lord, I pray. Amen. Right, let's start with a simple question, guys. Who wrote the book of Job? Well, thankfully, the answer is relatively simple. We don't actually know. It's anonymous. The book of Job is anonymous. But there are hints that the author of Job was a wise man, perhaps one who sat in the royal court. For example, he was clearly intelligent. We see that. So we see it in the structure and the composition of the book, but also it uses proverbs and ironies and parallels and riddles and rhetorical questions. This is clearly an educated man. Not just that, but he has an extensive knowledge, as we see throughout the book, of nature, of plant life, of animal life. So he uses 5 different words for lion in chapter 4. He has a detailed knowledge of wild animals and their habits in chapters 38 to 39. In chapter 28, he shows his familiarity with precious gems. He uses 13 different words for different precious gems and precious stones. And throughout, he is knowledgeable about weather patterns and what that means and what it looks like. And so this man is clearly an intelligent author. And why might he have been a member of the royal court? Well, he seems to be familiar with foreign lands. So, for example, right there at the beginning of the book, chapter 1, verse 1, there was once a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. Where's Uz? Well, as far as we can tell, it's possibly Aram in modern-day Syria or Edom in modern-day Jordan, but these are outside of the boundaries of Israel as we would know it. So he's clearly familiar with foreign places. Okay, there's our first question. Who wrote it and who was it? But our second question is, when was it written? And you often hear when you talk to Christians on this issue, when you listen to sermons, you will hear this notion that it is the earliest written book in the Bible. We don't know that for certain. Of course we don't. But it does certainly seem that it was written early. Some even suggest it was written by Moses, but I can't possibly give you an absolute certainty on that one. But either way, we're talking here about an ancient work of Hebrew wisdom that tells the story of this man Job. Again, who is this man Job? Well, he's associated with the land of Uz, and we know that he might not have originated from there, because in chapter 42 there's this really interesting detail when everything is put right. All his siblings and associates, to say, have come to him, eventually managed to attend to him, who heard about what had happened, but they eventually find their way to him, which suggests that they'd taken some time to travel from their homeland to where he is. In chapters 1 to 2, we are shown that he is relatively affluent. He has a wife, he has 7 sons, he has 3 daughters, he has livestock. But beyond that point, we don't know too much more. The book of Ezekiel mentions a Job alongside Noah and Daniel, who are known and reported for their righteousness. And the apostle James talks about famously the patience of Job. But beyond those mentions, beyond this book, we don't know much more about him. Again, what we do know, though, is that this book of Job is part of the wisdom literature of Scripture. What do we mean by that? I've been going through the book of Proverbs with the Arise Kids and assemblies on Friday mornings, trying to explain what wisdom is in the Bible. It's actually a bit more complicated than you think. But a great verse that summarizes it is this, Proverbs 15. For the wise, the path of life leads upwards in order to avoid Sheol below. Let me say that again. For the wise, the path of life leads upwards in order to avoid Sheol, the pit below. So wisdom leads to a life of flourishing, and folly, foolishness, leads to a life of suffering. And wisdom is mentioned many times in the book of Job. And we find even in chapter 28, a whole chapter dedicated to wisdom. And we're going to come back to this theme of wisdom in future sermons. But this is the essence of the book. What does it mean to be wise in our sufferings? What does it mean to be wise in our sufferings? If wisdom leads to a life of flourishing, then how do we account for the suffering of the wise? If the wise are those who know and understand, then what do we do when suffering doesn't make any sense and we can't understand why it's happening to us? These are not insignificant questions. These are some of the most basic questions that affect all of us as human beings. And this is what the book of Job speaks directly into. What about the content of the book of Job? Who are its main characters, so to speak? We've already said there's Job, there's his wife, there's his children, there is siblings later on in the book. We've also got Job's friends. And I want to name these 3 in particular. There's Eliphaz. Nick, you obviously read out Job 1 to 3, and these friends are mentioned in Job 2. There's Eliphaz. Now, Eliphaz, in his exchanges with Job, is initially quite reverent. He's quite polite towards Job. He says in chapter 4, if one ventures a word with you, will you be offended? He's quite polite with him. But as we'll see in future sermons, his main argument is that Job is suffering because Job has sinned. That's his argument, that Job is suffering because Job has sinned. Eliphaz then tells Job not to despair. God is just disciplining for him for his wrongdoing. He says this in chapter 5, how happy is the one whom God reproves. Therefore do not despise the discipline of the Almighty, is what the friend says to him. Then you've got Bildad. Now, Bildad is harsh, he's blunt, he's to the point. He even says in chapter 8 to Job, how long will you say these things and the words of your mouth be like a great wind? Like he's pumping from his mouth or something, But like Eliphaz, Bildad is trying to say something positive. Shut up, recognize God is trying to better you. He says this in chapter 8, if you will seek God, Job, and make supplication to the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, surely he will rouse himself for you and restore you to your rightful place. That your beginning was small, your latter days will be very great. Again, Bildad is trying to say, look, if you just shut up and recognize that God is trying to help you, it'll all be all right for you. 2 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad. 3rd friend, Zophar. Now, Zophar, like Bildad, is very blunt. He's also frustrated by what he sees as Job's ungodly moaning. So he says this in chapter 11. Should a multitude of words go unanswered, and should one full of talk be vindicated? Should your babble put others to silence? And when you mock, shall no one name you? And there's he's saying, again, these moanings, these whinings, this is ungodly. He is, like the others, saying people suffer because they've sinned. People suffer because they've sinned, and you can make all this disappear if you just admit it. Now, in all this, I want to say this. What do the friends do? Nick, you read it out. What do the friends do originally with Job? What do they do in chapter 2? They sit in silence with him. Then in Job chapter 3, as Nick also read, Job has this moment of despair, and that is what precipitates, that's what causes the friends to go on these moments of, at times condemnation, at times chastising, at times protest at what Job is saying. And one of the great challenges for us as we read the book of Job is trying to figure out, and this is always the challenge, this is one of the reasons it's difficult for many of us to study this book, is in what they're saying, what is true? In what they're saying, what is right? Like when Zophar says that people suffer because of sin, is that right? Well, that's exactly the question of the book of Job. That's exactly what is encountered. That's exactly what is proposed. That's exactly what is studied. Later on, we're going to encounter Elihu. We're also going to encounter, of course, God and the heavenly council and the character of Satan. But all these characters come together to form this story. And it's told over 42 chapters, and it's structured in 5 main parts. The first part is Job 1, verses 1. Even if you have it in your Bibles now, as you just flick with me. Job 1, verses 1 to 12. Again, Nick, you read it out for us. That is our introduction to Job and the meeting of the heavenly council when Satan goes to God and talks about Job. Then you have second part, Job chapter 1, verse 13, all the way to the end of chapter 3. What you have there is the affliction of Job and then the despair of Job. Obviously, his friends have arrived. Initially, they're silent. They sit in silence, having seen his suffering, but they eventually speak, and that's the next part. Chapters 4, all the way to 37. Again, you get these speeches of Job and his friends, and they go around in cycles. In chapter 38, God enters the stage. Finally, he intervenes and he speaks into Job's life. And by chapter 42, Job repents. He puts his hand over his mouth and says, I've spoken of things too wonderful for me. And then this remarkable ending. Chapter 42, verses 7 to 17. When God confronts the friends and he rebukes them. And Job is put in a position of intercessor for his friends. And God restores all of the blessings and more so that Job previously enjoyed, and more so. Now, this series will almost certainly stretch to February or March of next year, and I challenge you to read the book of Job along with me. You've already read the first 3 chapters because we forced you to, Job 1 to 3. But the next time I'm going to be preaching is Sunday the 1st of December. I would recommend that you read chapters 4 to 27 with me before then and now. It's only 1 chapter a day or so, just over. I think we can all do that. I'm sure it's relatively easy. For now, though, let's start with chapters 1 to 3. Now, we've already heard these read out loud in their entirety, but a few things stand out before we even get going. First, did you notice? Job is portrayed not just as righteous, but like super righteous. Super right. Look, he goes above and beyond the call of duty. Because we're heading into the Christmas season, and Emily, you and I, again, sorry, I'm not picking your promise, it's like the second time now, but Emily and I were talking about the Dickens' Christmas Carol. You know how it starts? There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story that I'm about to relate. You know that? Remember that? Well, likewise, it's important that we observe that the author of the book of Job describes Job's righteousness in these sorts of detail, in these sorts of terms. Listen to this from Job 1, verse 5. Job would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of his children. For Job said, it may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. This is what Job always did. So here he is not just sacrificing for himself, but he's sacrificing for his children, and not just sacrificing for his children, but sacrificing in case they did something. So this is above and beyond the call of duty, really. Also note, and this is something that becomes very plain as we get into chapter 1 and chapter 2, this is a world of powers and principalities. As I've said a few times here before, we're not rationalists, right? We're not rationalists. We shouldn't deny the supernatural just to combat what's crazy. I'm going to say that again. We shouldn't deny the supernatural just to combat what's crazy. We are encountering here in the book of Job the very real reality that angels exist, that demons exist, that there is a heavenly council, that the unseen realm exists. C.S. Lewis said this in his Screwtape Letters: there are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. And this is a balance that we must hold. But what is abundantly obvious is that the book of Job cannot make sense unless we make room for the unseen realm, for these powers and principalities. Look at Job 1 verse 6. We're given an insight into the courtroom of heaven. One day, the heavenly beings, the sons of God in other translations, came to present themselves before the Lord. And we see this language elsewhere in the Bible. This is from the Psalms, Psalm 82. God has taken his place in the midst of the divine council. In the midst of the gods, the heavenly beings, he holds judgment. So it's not like this should surprise us. The book of Job is saying something that we already read elsewhere in the Bible. But specifically, the book of Job names a reality to which later on the New Testament gives more detail. Namely this: with regards to Nick's series, we have an enemy, and his name is Satan. The Ha-Satan, the accuser. How does the book of Revelation describe Satan? Revelation 12 verse 10, as the accuser of the brethren. And again, this is one of our most detailed accounts in the Old Testament of Satan. It's relatively rare. We have Satan mentioned in Numbers 22, Balaam's adversary. We have Satan mentioned in 1 Chronicles 21, in which Satan is said to have stood against or before Israel. And in Zechariah 3, one of the visions, Satan is accusing Joshua. But this is one of the most explicit moments. Again, we're not rationalists. We shouldn't deny the supernatural just to combat what's crazy. Just because some people say that Satan steals your car parking space doesn't mean you should deny it. Not that, but you know what I mean. Deny Satan. You know what I mean? We should not deny that which the Bible reveals. And here we have revealed an unseen realm. Thirdly, when Job at last then is afflicted, when he suffers so, the author of this book doesn't flinch from showing us the reality of that suffering. What does Job suffer here? Look at chapter 1, verses 15 and following. He suffers a barbaric attack on his family by Sabaean raiders. He suffers a fire from heaven that destroys both his livestock and his servants. Verse 16. Verse 17, he suffers another barbaric attack, this time by the Chaldeans on his livestock and his servants. And in verse 18, he suffers something like a tornado that kills his remaining family. And the awfulness of what Job is experiencing is highlighted by that wonderful Hebrew repetition. Did you notice it? While he was still speaking. While he was still speaking. Blow after blow after blow. While he was still speaking, these tribulations come. And not just that, there's another dimension here that's easy to miss. In chapter 2, we see the effect of suffering on those around him. I mean, this is something that many of us who've gone through this can relate to. One of the worst things is seeing its impact on those whom you love, those around you. And what you have here in Job's wife is Job experiences alienation from his wife. In chapter 2, verse 9, his wife even says, "Why don't you just curse God and die?" Again, that must have felt like an incredibly lonely moment for Job. After all of that, to lose the support of his wife. In all of what happens, what does Job say, at least for now? That famous verse, verse 21 in chapter 1. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Okay. Original Church, there is something big here beyond these little details that I want us to focus on for the remainder of this sermon. We can't go around it. We can't go under it. We can't go over it. We have to go through it. We must come to terms with it, or else we have no hope of understanding this book as we go forward. What is this big, unavoidable object? We find it in Job 1, verse 12. Job 1, verse 12. Let me just check that for us. It might be Job 2, verse 12. Hang on, I'm just realizing I might have an error on my script. It was very late last night when I was doing this. Job 1, verse 12. Job, sorry, beg your pardon. Job, wow, I'm way off. Job 1 verse 6. Sorry, Job 2 verse 6. Job, wow, nothing in that was right. Job 2 verse 6. Goodness me, I needed more Weetabix, clearly. Right, Job 2 verse 6. When Satan comes again to God and asks for that permission to afflict Job, what does God say? What are those two? Now, your translation might differ. I think, Nick, you put it as behold. My translation here is very well. That's what God says. Very well. He gives permission for Job's suffering. Very well, God says. All that he has is in your power. This is our immovable object. This is something we must address. And I want to do so sensitively, but it is simply this. Job's suffering was ordained by the Lord. This is something much of the modern church would choke on. Previous generations were far more familiar with death and suffering than we are. Far more. When you look at old paintings, you'll often find this little trope, this little feature. It's usually a skull in the corner of the frame. Why? It's a memento mori. Remember, you will die. Again, previous generations were far more familiar with this reality than we are. It was a daily occurrence. Think about this in more traditional churches, which obviously for a time were the majority. People would walk past the graves of their ancestors every single Sunday. This reminds us, so they were, so we will be. And yet, I've been in so many churches where the very thought of God being sovereign over suffering is considered evil. When I was unwell, I was told I simply didn't have enough faith to make me better. After all, Christ purchased my healing on the cross, and he never means for us to suffer, so therefore, fill in the blank. Watch on church, do you know what the result of this is? Not only do we fail to understand this book, which is obviously important for us now, but also, as I've said before, in other contexts, at TTS and elsewhere, false doctrine isn't just wrong, it's cruel. It leaves the unbeliever, it leaves the believer. If we have this mindset that God can never ordain suffering for us, it leaves the believer unprepared for when suffering does come their way. What are you saying, Nathan? That God is a cruel tyrant who treats us like a kid with a magnifying glass of burning ants? No, brother. No, sister. I'm not saying that. This is from the Heidelberg Catechism. Question: what do you understand by the providence of God? Answer: the almighty and ever-present power of God, by which he upholds, as with his hand, heaven and earth and all creatures, and so rules them, that leaf and blade, rain and drought, fruitful and lean years, food and drink, health and sickness, prosperity and poverty, all things come to us not by chance, but by his kind fatherly hand. If you think I'm saying this as some doctrinaire theologian just dotting my I's and crossing my T's, you're wrong. This has been a lifeline to me for 10 years. All things, fruitful and lean years, food and drink, health and sickness, prosperity and poverty, children or no children, all things come to us from his kind fatherly hand. All I'm asking us to observe here is that which the book of Job makes no effort to conceal. That is to say, it is not embarrassed, it is not coy, it is not shy in saying and proclaiming and testifying that our good and righteous God was on the throne all throughout chapters 1 to 3. What did Job say? Blessed be the name of the Lord, he gives and takes away. Yes, but do you know what he goes on to say? Look again, chapter 1, verses 21 to 22. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. In saying, the Lord gives and takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord, he did not sin. It was right and righteous for him to say these things. And not just Job, brothers and sisters, but Jesus too. This is John chapter 9, when he encounters the blind man born from birth. As he walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him." And when he had said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam." Then he went and washed and came back able to see. What do we see here? At once, there is a rebuke of that deathly, legalistic logic of karma. No, it isn't because he sinned or his father, his parents sinned. That's not what's going on. Why? What is the purpose in it? That God's good design might be fulfilled. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. Job believed what Jesus would later teach, what the rest of the scriptures teach, that God is sovereign over all things, even our suffering, in all aspects of life. Job 12, verse 10, "In his hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of every human being." Psalm 104, "God made the moon to mark the seasons. The sun knows its time for setting." Proverbs 21, "The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wills." Proverbs 16, "The lot is cast into the lap, but the decision is the Lord's alone." And in all of it, blessed be the name of the Lord. He gives and takes away. And Job didn't sin or charge God with wrongdoing. There is nothing unrighteousness. There is nothing unrighteous in what we're saying. Brothers and sisters, please hear me. Our suffering does not come as a surprise to God, with whom there is no shadow of turning. He's not taken aback by your pain, nor is his perfect and kind will for you frustrated by it. And we need to hear this. Again, as I had prayed earlier, the one who keeps you neither slumbers nor sleeps. Exodus 3, he knows the sufferings of his people. Psalm 10, he does see, indeed he notes our troubles and griefs, that he might take them into his hands. Psalm 31, our times are in his hands, and he always hears our supplications. Please hear me. Don't switch off. Psalm 34, "For the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit." Don't switch off. Psalm 42, "By day the Lord commands his steadfast love for you, and at night, when your pillow is wet with tears, his song is with you." Despite the fact that they record something tragic, there is still hope to be found in these first few chapters of Job. When sorrows like sea billows roll, though Satan should buffet, though trials should come, whatever our lot, he is still our kind Father, and so it can be well with our souls. And as I come to land, I want you to please bear with me as I make a few comments. First, I've preached on Job before, but years ago. This is different. This is different. Not just in substance, but in other ways too. Again, forgive me, I don't mean to be too self-indulgent here, but this is the first time I'm preaching on this as an elder. And I am acutely aware that I'm looking out across this congregation, and each of you are going through your own things. Each of you are going through your own tribulations, and some of which I have no idea what that's like. I would love to be able to tell you, this is why God is doing this. This is why you're going through this. I want to do that because I love you. But the secret things belong to God. But what I have, I can give you, namely, that there is hope in our sufferings, and that Christ is with us in our sufferings. Indeed, on the note of that, we shouldn't let this pendulum swing too far. What do I mean? Because much of the modern church lacks a robust theology of suffering. Sometimes I've noticed this, the pendulum can swing all the way over here. And so suddenly the book of Job, as I've heard it sometimes preached and talked about, is all about sitting in the uncertainty and the lament and the darkness and the pain. And I have friends who still live in Chester, and I think I've said this before at TTS, but one particular, I've talked about them before here. They've got did have two disabled children. One of them sadly has died in the last 6 months. And they've gone through all sorts of stuff. And I remember the woman in question, the couple, was listening to this sermon, and it was on suffering. I think it was even on the book of Job. And at the end, she just very gently, because she's a lovely woman, really, really lovely, went up to the preacher in question and said, I understand what you're saying. It was helpful in many ways. But one thing you've got to know is that suffering, it doesn't always have to be dark. There can be joy in it too. And so what am I saying? I don't mean to suggest here that because, again, the modern church lacks a theology of suffering, that we have to be all about lament and darkness and pain. There can be hope. God is with us, even in the midst of our suffering and even as we weep. While preparing for this sermon, I listened to a lecture by a Jewish scholar and rabbi on the book of Job. I just wanted to hear a different perspective. He said this, listen to this, quote, "The book of Job is probably, and I would say more than probably, maybe even certainly, the most difficult book in the Bible. In fact, it's a tremendous theological problem, how it ever got into the Bible. Job raises incredible problems, and the one problem that Job raises more than anything else is that God doesn't come off looking very good." Brothers and sisters, our reading of this book as Christians must be different. There is one statement by Job that should change our entire reading of this book. And it's in Job chapter 9, verse 33. Job laments. Job says, "If only there was a mediator, an umpire between us who might lay his hand on us both. If only there were a mediator between us who might lay his hand on us both." Brothers and sisters, we know his name. And his name is Jesus Christ. This can't be for us only a story of darkness and lament. It can't be. Why? Because even in our darkness, Isaiah 60 verse 1, which of course is the very inspiration for the name of the secondary school provision, "Arise, shine, for your light has dawned." His name is Jesus Christ. And for all the complexity of life and for all the hardness of grief, the God of Job has made himself known in a way that that rabbi does not know, and in a way that Job could never imagine, could never expect. What does Jesus say? That the prophets and kings long to hear and see what you have heard and seen. He became flesh and tabernacled amongst us. And brothers and sisters, he endured Job's suffering and worse. He suffered for you, for me, for us, and for our salvation. And this must change everything as we continue our study of this book. As we talk about God allowing suffering. As we talk about what it means, and we will talk about what it means to console someone when they're suffering. As we go on to talk about anxieties and fears in our suffering. As we go on to talk about God putting all things right. At all times, Christ must stay in our view. And this isn't cheating. I mean, that's often how it was said when I was at uni. They would scoff at that sort of reading that I'm giving you. Let's scoff at them. Christ is our interpretation. Christ is our hope. Christ is the plumb line. The risen Christ sits enthroned over the book of Job. He is Emmanuel, God with us, even in our pain. With him, through him, and for him, God makes all things for good for those who love him. That is our hope. And so watch on, church, as we go through this, I would encourage us to have one thing. In the words of Pilate, behold the man. See him. See Christ. See the true Job who suffered for our suffering. who endured our trials and tribulation. He is our hope in grief. He is our hope in life and in death. And he is the rock that we kiss when waves crash us against the shore. Paul says this, and I'll finish with this. This is 2 Corinthians 4, verses 7 to 11. And again, I wish I could be able to tell you why God has done this in your life, or why this has happened, or why that has happened. I can't give you the minute reasons why your life is the way it is. Again, the secret things belong to the Lord. But what he has revealed about the nature of our suffering, about the nature of Christian believers' suffering, is this. This is 2 Corinthians 4, verses 7 to 11. But we have this treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not driven to despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies. For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our mortal flesh. Did you notice the so that? Why are we suffering? Well, I'm sure there are all sorts of reasons in the purposes of God, which we will know one day in full when we behold him face to face. But what are the so that's? We have this treasure so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to him. We are always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our bodies. And we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our mortal flesh. If you want to know what the purpose of Christian suffering is, why God designs it, why he promises in his word those who wish to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Why does he do it? So that like clay jars, when we smash, and you will smash, when you smash, what comes out? Christ. And you put on a display to the world, to the heavenly realm, to those waiting and watching and seeing what it means for him to be all sufficient, all beautiful, all comforting. You put him on display. Amen.